step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. I departed from Mojaisk on the morning of the 12th and arrived that evening at Marshal Ney's headquarters in a village near Kubinskoye. The regiments of the 3rd Corps were bivouacked around the village. The Marshal received me with his usual kindness. I had served under him a few years earlier, and I considered it a double privilege in these circumstances to again be under his command. The next morning, I was formally introduced to my regiment by General de Henin, who commanded the brigade. Here is the composition of the 3rd Corps. Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Ney. Chief of Staff, General Gouret. A 3rd Infantry Division consisting of Württemberg troops under General Marchand had been reduced to just 1,000 men. Originally commanded by the Prince of Württemberg at the start of the campaign, he faced severe reprimands from the Emperor over the misconduct of his troops, a problem exaggerated by French officers. When the Prince tried to enforce stricter discipline, survival through foraging became nearly impossible. Starving soldiers scattered, and the Prince himself, ill and discontented, left the army. The 4th Line Regiment, formed during the early years of the Revolution, had participated in all the German campaigns and counted Joseph Bonaparte among its colonels. By the time I assumed command, the officers could be divided into 3 groups. The first, made up of cadets freshly graduated from military school, were enthusiastic and educated but lacked experience. Their youth and fragile health made it difficult to endure the extreme hardships of this campaign. The second group consisted of veteran non-commissioned officers promoted to replace the heavy casualties sustained in these brutal campaigns. Though lacking formal education, they were seasoned soldiers, hardened to the rigours of war, and skilled in the practicalities of military life. The third group fell between the 2 extremes. Educated officers in their prime, shaped by experience, with a noble ambition to distinguish themselves and advance their careers. Unfortunately, this third group was the smallest. General Ledru had been a colonel for a long time and possessed a deep understanding of service both in peace and war. General Razout, an experienced officer, suffered from such poor eyesight that he had to rely entirely on those around him, which inevitably affected his battlefield decisions. Among the brigade generals, General Joubert showed average competence, while General de Henin had lost some of his military edge during a long captivity in England. Most colonels, however, were excellent soldiers. Colonel Pelleport, a volunteer who rose through the ranks of the 18th Regiment, commanded it with rare distinction. The greatest strength of the 3rd Corps lay in the leadership of Marshal Ney, whose audacity, persistence, and remarkable composure I will often highlight. From the outset, I was struck by the troops' exhaustion and diminished numbers. At the main headquarters, only results were considered, without regard for the cost, and no one fully grasped the dire state of the army. Upon taking command of the regiment, I delved into every detail and became aware of the full extent of the problem. The 4th Regiment, which had crossed the Rhine with 2,800 men, was now reduced to 900. As a result, the 4 battalions were consolidated into 2, and each company had an excess of officers and non-commissioned officers compared to its troops. Uniforms, particularly footwear, were in poor condition. At the time, we still had enough flour and some cattle and sheep, but these resources would soon run out. To replenish supplies, we had to keep moving, as we devastated any region we traversed in just 24 hours. What I observed in my regiment applied to the entire 3rd Corps, especially the Württemberg Division, which was nearly wiped out. Altogether, the Corps had fewer than 8,000 combat-ready soldiers out of an initial 25,000. Many officers, including the colonels of the 46th, 72nd, and 93rd Regiments, were absent due to injuries sustained in recent engagements. Never before had we suffered such heavy losses, and never had the morale of the army been so deeply affected. The soldiers no longer displayed their usual cheerfulness. The songs and stories that once lightened the fatigue of long marches were replaced by sombre silence. Even the officers seemed uneasy, serving more out of duty and honour than enthusiasm. This despondency, common in a defeated army, was striking even after a decisive victory that had opened the gates of Moscow. The march continued in 3 columns, as before the battle. The King of Naples led the vanguard with the cavalry, followed by the 1st and 3rd Corps, the Imperial Guard, and the headquarters. The 5th Corps formed the right column, and the 4th Corps the left. The march was orderly, with generals and officers leading their troops. General Kutuzov, believing Moscow indefensible, gradually withdrew his vanguard and retreated via the routes to Tver and Vladimir, leaving the city exposed. The French army bivouacked on the 13th at Perkushkovo, and the next day the vanguard entered Moscow. A group of armed civilians briefly defended the Kremlin, but was quickly dispersed. The vanguard advanced beyond the city, while the Emperor established himself in the Kremlin with the Guard. The 1st and 3rd Corps camped a quarter league outside Moscow, with strict orders not to enter. Thus we only glimpsed the ancient capital from afar, marvelling at its vast expanse, its multicoloured domes, and the incredible variety of its many buildings. That day seemed one of our happiest, promising an end to our efforts and a peace secured by the victory at the Moskwa and the capture of Moscow. Yet in that very moment, an unprecedented event dashed these hopeful expectations and underscored the futility of seeking reconciliation with the Russians. Moscow, which they could not defend, was set ablaze by their own hands. For some time, preparations for this massive fire had been underway. Governor Rostopchin had amassed a vast quantity of combustibles and incendiary rockets under the pretext of building a balloon to burn the French army. Meanwhile, his proclamations, aligned with those of General Kutuzov, reassured the people by falsely portraying Russian victories at Smolensk and the Moskova. The Russians claimed they were retreating only to take better positions and await reinforcements. As the Russian army reached the city's outskirts, the truth could no longer be hidden. Many residents fled, while others remained, trusting the French to preserve Moscow. On the morning of the 14th, the governor gathered 3,000 to 4,000 individuals from the city's lowest classes, including freed criminals. He distributed fuses and incendiary rockets and ordered police agents to spread throughout the city. Pumps were destroyed, and the departure of the civil authorities who followed the army signalled the fire's start. As the vanguard entered the city, they found it nearly deserted. While the emperor settled in the Kremlin, the vast bazaar containing over 10,000 shops was set ablaze. In the following days, fires ignited simultaneously across all districts. A strong wind spread the flames, and the pump's destruction made them impossible to extinguish. Arsonists caught in the act were shot on the spot. They claimed to be following Governor Rostopchin's orders and died with resignation. By the 6th day, the fire subsided for lack of fuel. 9/10 of the city was destroyed. The emperor, who had retreated to the Petrovsky Palace during the blaze, returned to the Kremlin to await peace proposals he still hoped for. However, far from being discouraged by the capture of Moscow, Emperor Alexander saw it as a reason to continue the war with even greater determination. General Kutuzov, correctly anticipating that we would march toward the southern provinces after leaving Moscow, abandoned the road to Vladimir. Instead, he circled around Moscow and positioned himself on the roads to Kaluga and Tula. This movement, illuminated by the fire that consumed Moscow, brought Russian indignation to its peak. Kutuzov established himself behind the Nara River, about 25 leagues from Moscow, and fortified his position with redoubts, thereby securing the routes to Kaluga and Tula. To advance into the southern provinces, we would need to fight another battle. Meanwhile, the Russian army replenished its losses with fresh levies, reorganized its supplies, and regained confidence with renewed strength. Amid these preparations, talk of peace at the outposts and feigned negotiations maintained Napoleon's hope for a resolution. The King of Naples moved toward Kaluga with the vanguard, facing the entrenched Russian camp, while the Third Corps was tasked with replacing him in the north on the roads to Tver and Vladimir, where the enemy had left an observation force. For the first time, I crossed Moscow's ruins at the head of my regiment. It was a scene both horrifying and surreal. Some houses seemed to have been completely levelled. Others stood with walls blackened by smoke. The streets were littered with debris of all kinds, and an acrid smell of burning filled the air. Occasionally, a thatched cottage, a church, or a palace stood intact amidst the devastation. The churches, with their domes painted in myriad colours and their ornate architecture, particularly recalled Moscow's former opulence. Most of the inhabitants, driven from their homes by the fire or our soldiers, had sought refuge in these churches. These unfortunate souls, wandering like spectres amidst the ruins and dressed in rags, resorted to desperate measures to survive. Some scavenged vegetables from the gardens that still grew, others tore scraps of flesh from dead animals lying in the streets, and some even dove into the river to retrieve fermenting grain dumped there by the Russians. As we marched through the city, the sound of drums and military music made the scene even more dismal, evoking the paradox of triumph amidst destruction, misery, and death. After passing through the vast expanse of Moscow, we were billeted in villages along the roads to Yaroslavl and Vladimir. I stayed at the estate of Kuskovo, owned by Count Sheremetyev, a man of immense wealth. Like everything else, this once beautiful residence had been looted. After exhausting the scarce resources of the surrounding region, we returned to Moscow and were stationed in the Vladimir suburb. This suburb, located to the north of Moscow, is traversed by the small Yauza River, which flows into the Moskva River in the city centre. Most of the houses were separated by cultivated plots or gardens. A few palaces stood out among the wooden structures, but almost everything had been burned. As a result, companies had to be quartered far apart, which created difficulties for service, policing, and maintaining discipline. I was stationed at the centre of my regiment with the senior officers in a large, well-preserved stone house. 40 local residents had taken refuge in a large hall within the same building. I ordered that they be protected and their suffering alleviated as much as possible, but there was little we could do for them, as we ourselves were on the verge of running out of everything. Black bread and beer were hard to come by. Meat was becoming scarce, and we had to send out large detachments to retrieve cattle from the woods where peasants had hidden them. Often, these detachments returned empty-handed. Such was the supposed abundance brought by the looting of Moscow. While we had access to liquor, sugar, and preserves, we lacked meat and bread. We wrapped ourselves in furs, but soon ran out of clothes and shoes. Surrounded by jewels, gemstones, and unimaginable luxuries, we were on the brink of starvation. A large number of Russian soldiers roamed the streets of Moscow. I arrested 50 of them and sent them to headquarters. When I reported this to a general, he remarked that I could have had them shot and was authorized to do so in the future. I refrained from abusing this trust. The misfortunes and chaos of our stay in Moscow are difficult to describe. Every officer and soldier could recount extraordinary anecdotes. One of the most striking involved a Russian whom a French officer found hiding in the ruins of a house. The officer gestured to reassure him, indicating he would protect him, and led him away. Soon after, needing to deliver an order and encountering another officer with a squad, he handed over the Russian, saying in haste, "I recommend this man to you." Misunderstanding the statement and its tone, the second officer assumed the Russian was an arsonist and had him executed. Early during the fire, a young German medical student, barely dressed and seemingly out of his mind, sought refuge at my bivouac. I took him in and housed him for nearly 3 weeks. He appeared grateful, but remained haunted by fear. One day, as a joke, I suggested he enlist in my regiment. That same evening he disappeared, and I never saw him again. The Russian army, meanwhile, was growing stronger every day along the banks of the Nara River. partisan groups scattered around Moscow became increasingly daring. The town of Varaya was captured by surprise, and its garrison massacred. Detachments and convoys trying to reach the army, along with the wounded and sick being transported to the rear, were intercepted on the road to Smolensk. Cossacks attacked our foragers almost at the gates of Moscow, while peasants killed isolated marauders. The King of Naples, whose cavalry had been nearly annihilated and had long subsisted on horsemeat, repeatedly urged for peace or retreat. However, the emperor refused to acknowledge the dire situation or listen to these pleas. In response to their complaints, the generals received orders from headquarters that were as extraordinary as they were impractical. At times, they were instructed to restore order in Moscow and protect peasants who might bring provisions to market, even though the surrounding areas were ravaged and the peasants had taken up arms against us. At other times, they were ordered to procure 10,000 horses in a region where there were neither horses nor inhabitants left. Plans were announced to spend the winter in a ruined city, where we would surely starve by October. Then came orders to have each regiment manufacture winter shoes and clothing, and when the colonels reported a lack of fabric and leather, they were told to look harder. To make these orders even more impossible to carry out, looting was strictly forbidden, and the Imperial Guard was confined to the Kremlin. A governor, an intendant, and various administrative bodies were appointed, yet an entire month passed without any improvement in our situation. Around October 10th, a division of the 4th Corps moved toward Dmitrov on the road to Tver. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney captured Bogorodsk, 12 leagues from Moscow, on the Vladimir Road. Barracks were constructed around this small town, ostensibly to winter there, but this charade fooled neither the enemy nor our soldiers. I did not accompany the force to Bogorodsk, as I was part of an expedition commanded by General Marchand along the Klyazma River, between the Vladimir and Tver roads. Part of my regiment was with me, while the remainder stayed with Marshal Ney. As usual, the enemy, adhering to their strategy, retreated as we advanced. General Marchand constructed a blockhouse on the banks of the Klyazma at a spot where a Cossack regiment had previously overrun a post. A competent officer was appointed to command this small fort, but then General Marchand suddenly received orders to return with the entire detachment. It was now clear that the army would soon leave Moscow, as efforts to defend its approaches were being abandoned. During this expedition, I encountered the same misery everywhere. The generals managed to collect some provisions, but there were no substantial resources available for the army. Peasants hid their food and refused to bring it forth, even when promised payment. A soldier from my regiment, the son of a farmer from Côte d'Or, died beside me at a bivouac fire. This young man had been wasting away for some time, consumed by a slow fever brought on by exhaustion and poor nutrition. He died of sheer depletion, and we buried him beneath a tree after ensuring he had truly passed. In his bag, we found letters from his mother, deeply moving in their simplicity. I mourned this unfortunate man, condemned to die far from his homeland and the family whose happiness he might have secured. Such tragedies were all too common among us. I recount this particular death, which I witnessed firsthand, because it seemed a harbinger of the calamities about to befall us. The detachment returned to Moscow on October 15th. 2 days passed without any mention of departure. On the 18th, the Emperor held a review of the 3rd Corps in the Kremlin courtyard. This review was as impressive as circumstances allowed. The colonels spared no effort to present their regiments in the best possible condition. Observing the troops, one would never have guessed the extent of their suffering. I am convinced that the army's dignified appearance amidst such hardships bolstered the Emperor's resolve, persuading him that with such men nothing was impossible. The entire present strength of the 3rd Corps barely reached 10,000 men. During the review, Monsieur de Béranger, aide-de-camp to the King of Naples, delivered news to the Emperor about the engagement at Winkowo, where our troops had been surprised and severely repelled the previous day. This incident ended the tacit armistice at the outposts, shattered any prospects of negotiation, and hastened our departure. The emperor's preoccupation was evident on his face. He quickly concluded the review, though he still made appointments to all vacant positions and distributed numerous decorations. He relied more than ever on his ability to inspire extraordinary efforts from his army. I took advantage of his favourable disposition to reward the most zealous officers in my regiment, many of whom received promotions. The general commanding the Württemberg division, under General Marchand's orders, was granted the title of Count of the Empire, with an endowment of 20,000 francs, a modest reward for the suffering endured by 12,000 men, reduced by fatigue and privation to just 800. Hardly had the review concluded when orders were issued for departure the following day. Returning to my quarters, I directed preparations, loading what remained of our provisions onto carts. Unable to carry all the flour, I left the remainder in the house. Though advised to destroy it, I could not bring myself to deprive the unfortunate inhabitants further, and gladly gave it to them as compensation for the harm we had inflicted. Their blessings, received with emotion and gratitude, may well have brought me luck. The emperor, having abandoned all hope for peace, could now only focus on retreat. The army needed to cross back over the Dwina and Dnieper rivers, re-establish communication on the left with the 2nd and 6th Corps, and on the right with the 7th Corps and the Austrians defending the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The road to Smolensk, entirely ravaged, offered no resources. Thus, it was decided to head toward Kaluga and bypass the entrenched enemy positions by taking the route through Borovsk and Maloyaroslavets. In this way, the imprudence of our extended stay in Moscow might be remedied. Victory could open the road to the southern provinces, or at least enable us to retreat toward Mogilev via Roslavl or Smolensk via Maydin and Elnya, crossing regions less affected by the war. The 4th Corps already occupied Fominskoye on the old Kaluga road. It formed the vanguard and was to deliver the initial blows. However, as the departure approached, the emperor wished to leave traces of his vengeance in Moscow, completing the destruction that the despair of the Russians had not yet accomplished. Marshal Mortier was ordered to remain in Moscow for a few days with the young guard to protect the retreat of other army corps against enemy detachments stationed along the northern route. At the same time, he was to blow up the Kremlin and set fire to whatever remained intact. Thus, the annihilation of this unfortunate city was completed, first burned by its own citizens, then ravaged and destroyed by its conquerors. The marshal's moderation in executing these harsh orders, along with the care he took for the wounded and sick amid such devastation, honoured both his heart and character. On the night of October 18th, the 3rd Corps' baggage trains gathered at the Seminovsky convent, the designated assembly point. Never before had we dragged so many vehicles in our wake. Each company had at least one cart or sled for carrying its provisions. The night barely sufficed to load and organize everything. An hour before dawn, all companies assembled in front of my quarters, and we departed. The march had an eerie, sombre quality. The darkness, the silence of our movements, and the still smouldering ruins underfoot all combined to cast a pall of sorrow over the imagination. Every one of us felt unease as this memorable retreat began. Even the soldiers acutely sensed the precariousness of our situation. They possessed that keen intelligence and admirable instinct so characteristic of French soldiers, which not only grasped the full extent of the danger, but seemed to heighten the courage needed to face it. The Seminovsky convent, located near the Kaluga gate, was in flames when we arrived. Supplies that could not be carried were being burned, and, in a characteristic oversight of that time, the colonels had not been informed. Several wagons still had space, yet we watched provisions being destroyed before our eyes, provisions that might have saved our lives. The 3rd Corps assembled and set off along the new Kaluga road, joined by the 1st Corps and the Imperial Guard. At that time, my regiment consisted of 1,100 men, and the 3rd Corps had been reduced to no more than 11,000. I estimate that the entire army departing Moscow numbered about 100,000. The sight of this army on the march was extraordinary. The vast plains surrounding Moscow allowed one to observe every detail. Trailing behind us was everything that had escaped the city's flames. The most elegant and luxurious carriages mingled chaotically with wagons, droshkis, and carts laden with provisions. These vehicles moved in rows along Russia's wide roads, giving the appearance of an immense caravan. From atop a hill, I paused to take in this remarkable scene, reminiscent of the campaigns of Asia's great conquerors. The plain was covered with this sprawling baggage train, and the distant spires of Moscow framed the view. We were halted in this spot, as if to grant us a final glimpse of the ruins of that ancient city, soon to vanish from our sight. After 2 days of marching, the Third Corps reached Chirikovo and took up a position guarding the junction of the roads to Podolsk and Fominskoye. Meanwhile, the First Corps and the Guard advanced via a flank march along the old Kaluga road to support the Fourth Corps. The Third Corps, designated to follow this movement last, held its position at Chirikovo for 3 days before departing at midnight on the 23rd. That night's march was dreadful. Torrential rain fell, and the secondary roads we used were completely churned up. We did not reach Borovsk until the evening of the 26th. Throughout this march, we were harassed by Cossacks who dared not mount a serious attack against us. I devoted all my efforts to maintaining order, discipline, and service accuracy within my regiment, and I had nothing but praise for both the officers and soldiers. However, when one sergeant, generally a reliable man, displayed negligence while commanding an advanced post, I ordered his demotion despite his captain's pleas. Generals Girardin and Burman flanked our march with light cavalry, carrying orders to set fire to every village along the way. We joined the Grand Headquarters at Borovsk, where we learned of the latest events. General Kutuzov, informed of the French army's march along the old Kaluga road, had abandoned his camp at Tarutino. A parallel flanking maneuver brought him to Maloyaroslavets, where he encountered and attacked the Fourth Corps. Despite being outnumbered, the French emerged victorious in this brilliant battle. However, Kutuzov had established a fallback position 6 leagues behind, fortified with redoubts. One of his divisions was already attempting to outflank our right via the Medin road. This left us with 2 options: fight another battle or retreat. The situation was grave, the moment decisive. Marshal Bessieres and other generals advised retreat. Their reasoning was not a lack of confidence in victory, but the heavy losses a battle would inflict, leading to disorganization. The cavalry and artillery horses were weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition. How could they be replaced if lost? How could artillery, ammunition, and the wounded be transported? In such circumstances, continuing toward Kaluga seemed reckless, and prudence dictated retreat toward Smolensk. Count Lobau even declared repeatedly that not a moment should be lost in making for the Niemen. Napoleon hesitated for a long time, spending the entire day of the 25th studying the battlefield and consulting his generals. Finally, he decided on retreat, and it must be acknowledged that one factor in his decision was the inevitability of abandoning the wounded after a battle. The entire army began to retreat toward Smolensk via Mozhaisk. The movement had already started when the Third Corps arrived at Borovsk. The First Corps acted as the rearguard. The Cossacks continued to harass us with their usual agility, attacking the Fourth Corps' baggage trains, then those of the Grand Headquarters, and even the Emperor himself, though his escort quickly repelled them. The roads were congested with all kinds of vehicles, causing delays at every step. We encountered swollen streams that had to be crossed either on flimsy planks or directly through the water. By the morning of the 28th, the Third Corps had occupied Vereya. That evening, we reached Gorodok-Borisov. Finally, on the 29th, skirting the ruins of Mozhaisk on our right, we rejoined the main road below the town. The suffering awaiting our army in areas devastated by both the Russians and the French was easy to imagine. If any houses still stood, they were deserted. Smolensk, 80 leagues away, was our first source of supplies. Until then, we could expect to find neither flour, nor meat, nor forage in any village. We relied solely on the provisions brought from Moscow. These provisions, however, were limited and unevenly distributed, as is often the case with loot. One regiment might have preserved some cattle but lacked bread. Another might have flour but no meat. Even within the same regiment, this inequality was evident. Some companies starved, while others had an abundance. Commanders ordered supplies to be shared, but selfishness often found ways to evade oversight and authority. Moreover, to conserve our supplies, we needed to preserve the horses that transported them. Yet every day, many horses died from lack of feed. Soldiers who strayed off the road to forage for food often fell into the hands of Cossacks or armed peasants. The road was littered with exploded caissons, abandoned cannons, and vehicles left behind when the horses could no longer pull them. From the outset, this retreat bore all the hallmarks of a rout. The emperor continued to exact vengeance on the houses along the way. Prince Deckmule, commanding the rearguard, was tasked with setting everything on fire, and the order was carried out with meticulous thoroughness. Detachments sent out to the right and left of the road burned chateaux and villages as far as they could while still staying ahead of the enemy. Yet this spectacle of destruction was not the most horrifying. A column of Russian prisoners marched ahead of us, guarded by troops from the Confederation of the Rhine. These prisoners were barely given scraps of horsemeat, and their guards killed any who could no longer keep up. We came across their corpses along the route, all with crushed skulls. I must commend the soldiers of my regiment who were outraged by such brutality. They also recognized the cruel retaliation this barbarity could provoke against any of our own who fell into enemy hands. Passing through the village of Borodino, several officers visited the battlefield of the Moskva. The debris remained scattered across the terrain, and the dead from both armies lay where they had fallen. Some claimed that living wounded were still found there, though I cannot believe it, as no evidence of this was ever confirmed. By the evening of the 29th, we were at the abbey of Kolotskoye, initially transformed into a hospital, but now reduced to a vast cemetery. In the ruined town of Gzhatsk, a single surviving building served as a hospital for the sick. Colonels were ordered to identify any men from their regiments among the patients. The sick had been left without medicine, food, or any assistance. It was nearly impossible to enter the building due to the filth that filled the staircases, corridors, and even the rooms. Despite this, I managed to find 3 men from my regiment, whom I had the satisfaction of rescuing. On November 1st, we arrived in Vyazma. A few huts located in the Moscow suburb provided us with shelter. However meagre, this accommodation felt like a blessing after 15 days of bivouacking. Meanwhile, as soon as General Kutuzov noticed the French army's retreat, he dispatched General Miloradovich with a significant force and all of Platov's Cossacks to pursue us, while he himself led the main Russian army via the Elnya route to reach the Dnieper before us. General Miloradovich, whose vanguard closely followed the First Corps, advanced parallel to the main road, allowing his troops to operate in less ravaged areas compared to those we traversed. Additionally, the secondary roads taken by his forces were shorter than the main road, giving the enemy an opportunity to outflank our rear guard and arrive ahead of us in Vyazma. In these circumstances, some criticized the emperor for not marching faster, yet both men and especially horses were utterly exhausted from fatigue. To accelerate the march, it would have been necessary to abandon all baggage. Undoubtedly, such a decision could have prevented significant misfortunes. However, at the time, no one could bring themselves to take such an extreme measure. On November 3rd, General Miloradovich emerged onto the main road about a league from Vyazma and launched a fierce attack on the Fourth Corps, which was advancing toward the town. This maneuver cut off the Fourth Corps and the First Corps following it, forcing them to break through a superior enemy force equipped with more cavalry and artillery. Simultaneously, another Russian division attempted to seize Vyazma via the Medin Road. Fortunately, Marshal Ney, still holding the town, had made arrangements to thwart this effort. The small rivers Vlitsa and Vyazma form a semicircle around the town on the side of the Medin Road, making its defence easier. General Ledru's division took up a position on the plateau, dominating these rivers, successfully preventing the enemy from forcing a crossing. Meanwhile, General Razut's division advanced along the Moscow Road to assist the 1st and 4th Corps. After a fierce 5-hour battle, these two corps managed to break through the enemy's lines and re-establish communication with us. We returned to the suburb, where I learned that the 3rd Corps was to relieve the 1st Corps as the rear guard. This critical and challenging mission could not have been entrusted to a more capable leader than Marshal Ney. I dare to say that we supported him with our utmost dedication. The commendable performance of my regiment during the day filled me with confidence. I informed the officers of the arduous yet honourable task assigned to us. As the 1st and 4th Corps passed through Vyazma, leaving us face to face with the enemy, we prepared ourselves to take up their position with dignity. It was a matter of honour, the reputation of our troops, and the salvation of the entire army. That concludes the 12th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.